Marvin Gaye's son watched his father die, then spent 40 years trying to finish what he started. The world finally listened. There is a boy standing in a hallway in Los Angeles. He is 15 years old. He has his father's eyes and his father's sensitivity and his father's particular way of absorbing everything in a room before he says a single word. He has grown up in the shadow of a voice that the world called the greatest of its generation, and he has grown up understanding, in the way that children of famous people understand things, that the shadow of a great voice is both a gift and a weight that takes decades to fully reckon with. On the morning of April 1st, 1984, the boy in the hallway hears something that he will spend the rest of his life trying to process. His name is Frankie Christian Gaye. The world knows him as Bubby. His father called him that. Bubby, the nickname that Marvin Gaye gave his adopted son from the beginning, the name that contained inside it a tenderness that Marvin expressed more easily in private than in public, more easily in the specific geography of fatherhood than in almost any other relationship in his complicated life. Bubby Gaye was in the house on Gramercy Place in Los Angeles on the morning his father died. He heard the argument escalate. He heard the shot. He was 15 years old, and he heard his grandfather shoot his father, and he could not stop it, and he could not undo it, and he has been living with that morning for every day of the 40 years that have followed. But this story is not only about that morning. This story is about what comes after. About what a child does when the most important person in his world is taken from him violently and prematurely and in a way that defies every rational framework for grief. About what it means to carry a name. Gaye, that name, the name that belongs to the greatest soul singer who ever lived, and to spend your life figuring out what your relationship to that name actually is. And about the music. Always about the music. Because Marvin Gaye left behind not just a son, but a body of work so large and so important that it has its own life, its own continued existence in the world, its own capacity to find people and do something to them that they cannot fully explain. Bubby Gaye spent 40 years in relationship with that music, protecting it, promoting it, fighting for it, sometimes hiding from it, and ultimately accepting that his deepest connection to his father was not the memory of the hallway on April 1st, 1984, but the sound that came out of the speakers when someone put on What's Going On and turned it up. To understand what Bubby carried, you need to understand who Marvin Gaye was as a father, not the public Marvin, the icon, the voice, the man on the album covers with the eyes that seemed to be looking at something just past the camera, something the rest of us could not see, the private Marvin, the man who came home. Marvin Gaye Jr. and Anna Gordy adopted Bubby in 1965 when Anna was unable to carry a pregnancy to term. Bubby arrived into a household that was, at that moment, at the peak of its public success and the beginning of its private unraveling. Marvin was a Motown star. The hits were coming fast. The tours were constant. The money, for the first time in his life, was real and plentiful and spent with the particular abandon of a man who had grown up with nothing and still half expected it to disappear. He was not home often. This is the truth about Marvin Gaye as a father in Bubby's earliest years. He was present in the way that men of his era and his profession were present, which is to say not very. He was on the road. He was in the studio. He was living the life that Berry Gordy's machine had created for him, performing 300 days a year, recording in the gaps, doing the work that the industry required and the work that his own ambition demanded. But when he was home, he was fully home. This is the other truth about Marvin Gaye as a father, the one that Bubby has spoken about in interviews over the years with the careful, considered honesty of someone who has done the work of actually understanding rather than simply mythologizing. When Marvin was present, he was present in a way that few people are. He had the quality. The same quality that made his music so intimate, so personal, so specifically addressed to whoever was listening, of making you feel that you were the only person who mattered. He would sit with Bubby for hours, talking about music, about the world, about the specific difficulties of being sensitive in a world that did not always reward sensitivity. He would play piano and let Bubby sit beside him and watch his hands. He would explain what he was hearing in a chord, what emotion lived in a particular combination of notes, why certain sounds made people feel things they could not name. He was teaching his son to listen. Not just to music, to everything. to the emotional frequencies of rooms and relationships and the space between what people said and what they meant. It was the same education that Alberta had given Marvin, passed down a generation, adapted for a different time and a different boy, but carrying the same essential message. The world is full of information if you know how to receive it. Your sensitivity is not a weakness. It is the instrument through which you understand what is actually happening. Bubby absorbed all of it. He was a quiet child, observant in the way of children who have learned early that watching is often more valuable than speaking. He watched his father perform the specific alchemy of being Marvin Gaye in public, the charisma, the warmth, the way he made every person he talked to feel chosen. And he watched his father come home and take off the performance and be something else, smaller in some ways, more uncertain, funnier. Capable of sitting on the kitchen floor with his son and laughing about nothing for an hour in a way that the public Marvin would not have recognized. He watched the marriage fall apart. Children always watch marriages fall apart more closely than their parents believe, because children have nothing else to do with their attention in those years except watch. Bubby watched his father and Anna move through the stages of a dissolution that had been building for years. The silences that lasted too long, the conversations that stopped when he entered the room, the gradual withdrawal of the warmth that had made the household feel like a household. The divorce was finalized in 1977. Bubby was 8 years old. He went with Anna. The separation from his father was not total. Marvin remained present in the specific, irregular way of a divorced father who is also a touring musician. But the daily texture of being in the same house, of hearing his father's voice from the next room, of falling asleep to the sound of piano coming from the living room was gone. He missed it in ways he could not have articulated then, and that took years to find language for. The years that followed were difficult to watch from the outside and more difficult to live from the inside. Marvin's decline through the late 1970s was not sudden or dramatic in the Hollywood sense. It was gradual and ordinary, and all the more painful for that ordinariness. The cocaine that had been a peripheral presence became more central. The creative periods grew more erratic. The man who had made What's Going On and Let's Get It On and Here, My Dear, was still there, still capable of producing music of extraordinary quality, but surrounded by an increasingly chaotic personal life that made sustained creative work harder and harder to maintain. Bubby saw it. Not all of it. He was a child, and the adults around him made the decisions about what he was allowed to see. But enough. Enough to understand that his father was struggling. Enough to feel, with the particular helplessness of a child watching a parent suffer, that there was nothing he could do except wait and hope and keep the connection alive in whatever form was available. The connection was always available. Whatever else was falling apart in Marvin Gaye's life, his relationship with his children was something he held on to. He called Bubby. He visited. He was physically there for the specific moments that mattered to him. Birthdays, school events, the ordinary markers of a child's life that most fathers attend without thinking, and that Marvin attended with the particular intentionality of a man who understood, at some level, that his time was not going to be unlimited. There is a photograph from this period. Not a famous photograph, not one that has appeared in retrospectives or coffee table books about Marvin Gaye's life. Of Marvin and Bubby sitting together at a piano. Bubby is 12 or 13. Marvin is leaning toward him, pointing at the keys, explaining something. Bubby is looking not at the keys, but at his father's face, with the expression of a child who is trying to memorize something he is afraid of losing. He was right to be afraid. The move to Europe happened in 1981. Marvin went first to London, then to Ostend in Belgium, driven by tax debts and the need to escape the specific chaos his life had become in Los Angeles. He was there for nearly 2 years, largely alone, watching the North Sea from a rented apartment and making the music that would eventually become Sexual Healing and the Midnight Love album. Bubby was 12, 13, 14 during those years. The distance was physical now as well as circumstantial, and the phone calls that had maintained the connection became the primary form of relationship. Marvin called when he could. Bubby answered. They talked about music. Always music. Always coming back to music, because music was the language they shared most fluently, the one in which both of them could say things that did not come as easily in ordinary conversation. Marvin came home in 1982. Sexual Healing reached #1. The Midnight Love Tour sold out arenas. The comeback was real and complete and joyful in the specific way that comebacks are joyful when the person coming back knows, at some level, what it costs to be away and is not taking the return for granted. Bubby was 14. His father was home. The world was listening to Marvin Gaye again in the way it had listened in the early 1970s. With attention and reverence and the recognition that this was not simply a great popular musician, but something rarer and more important. A voice that said something true. A voice that reached inside you and rearranged something there. And then, in the fall of 1983, Marvin made the decision that everyone who loved him feared. He moved back in with his parents. The reasons were complicated. Financial, psychological, the specific pull of the unresolved toward the place where it had originated. Bubby was not consulted. He was 15 years old, and his father was making decisions that adults around him were openly worried about and that he did not have the framework to fully understand. He understood that his grandfather was dangerous. He had always known this on some level. The knowledge had come the way children absorb the most important information about their world, through atmosphere rather than explicit statement. He knew that the house where his father was going to live was a house where things had happened that had shaped his father in ways that were still shaping him. He did not know how to stop him from going there. On the morning of April 1st, 1984, Bubby Gaye was in the house on Gramercy Place. The argument between his father and grandfather escalated in the way that arguments in that house had always had the potential to escalate. Marvin stepped between his parents. Marvin Gaye Sr. went to his room and came back with a gun. The gun that Marvin himself had given his father as a gift, an act of generosity that became, in retrospect, one of the most devastating ironies in a life full of them. Bubby heard the shot. He was 15 years old, and he heard his grandfather shoot his father, and there was nothing he could do. Marvin Gaye died at California Hospital Medical Center at 1:01 p.m. He was 44 years old, one day before his 45th birthday. The grief that followed was of the kind that does not resolve. Not in a year, not in a decade, not in 40 years of living with it. The loss of a parent to violence when you are 15 years old. When you are still in the process of becoming the person you are going to be, when your relationship with your parent is still unfinished, when there are things that have not been said and things that have not been resolved and a future that assumed their presence. That loss does not have a shape that fits neatly into any available framework for grief. Bubby Gaye spent years not talking about it publicly. He was a private person in a way that was both natural and necessary. The son of a famous man who had died in a famous and terrible way, surrounded by people who had opinions about his father and about what had happened and about what the legacy meant and what should be done with it, most of whom had not been in that house and none of whom had been 15 years old and heard that shot. He moved through his 20s and 30s in relative quiet. He built a life. He had relationships. He thought about his father constantly. Not in the consuming, paralyzing way of someone who has never found a way past grief, but in the ongoing, integrated way of someone for whom loss has become part of the texture of daily existence. He heard his father's music everywhere. You cannot live in the world and not hear Marvin Gaye's music. It is on the radio and in films and in the background of restaurants and in the playlists that people make for the moments of their lives that matter to them. Every time Bubby heard it, he felt something that he has described in various interviews as a mixture of pride and pain that never fully separates into its component parts. He began gradually to find his relationship to the legacy, not the commercial legacy. The record sales, the retrospectives, the critical reassessments, the list that put what's going on at the top of the greatest albums ever made. The personal legacy. The question of what it meant to be Marvin Gaye's son. What it meant to carry that name and those eyes and that sensitivity into a world that had decided it knew what Marvin Gaye was and what he meant and what his story was. The world's version of his father was not wrong exactly, but it was incomplete in the way that all public narratives about private people are incomplete. It had the hits and the battles and the social consciousness and the tragedy. It did not have the man who sat on the kitchen floor and laughed about nothing. It did not have the father who pointed at piano keys and explained what emotion lived inside a chord. It did not have the voice that called from Belgium and talked for an hour about music and said at the end, "I love you," in the way that some men can only say it when there is distance between them. Bubby started talking, not performing, talking. Giving interviews that were honest about the complexity of his father, about the gift and the difficulty of his legacy, about what it had cost and what it had given and what it continued to mean. He spoke about April 1st, 1984, with the careful, earned honesty of someone who has done real work on something real. He did not dramatize it, and he did not minimize it. He said what it was. He said that what had kept him was the music. That in the years after his father's death, when the grief was largest and the loss most acute, he had put on What's Going On and listened and heard something that was not available anywhere else. His father's voice, yes, but also something behind his father's voice, something that the voice was carrying and transmitting, something about the world and about love and about the specific difficulty of being human in a world that does not always make it easy to be human. He said that hearing the music was like hearing his father speak from wherever he had gone, not in a mystical sense. Bubby is not a mystical person, but in the sense that the music contained his father more completely than any photograph or biography or documentary could contain him. The music was where Marvin Gaye had put the truest things about himself, the things that were too large for conversation, too complex for an interview, too honest for the performance of daily life. The music was where you went to actually know Marvin Gaye, and Bubby had been listening for 40 years. He became an advocate for his father's legacy in ways that went beyond what most children of famous people do. He worked with the Marvin Gaye estate to ensure that the music was protected and presented correctly. He pushed back against narratives he felt were reductive or incomplete. He spoke at events and gave interviews and made himself available to journalists and documentarians who wanted to tell his father's story, not because he enjoyed public attention, but because he understood that the alternative was to let the story be told only by people who had not been in that house and had not heard that shot and had not sat beside his father at a piano and watched his hands. He was finishing something. Marvin Gaye had left things unfinished. The life cut short at 44, the relationships that did not resolve, the conversations that did not happen, the music that was still inside him when the music stopped. Bubby could not finish those things. Nobody could. But he could make sure the world understood what had been finished. The extraordinary, complete, irreplaceable body of work that his father had left behind. He could make sure that when people talked about Marvin Gaye, they were talking about the whole man. Not just the icon. Not just the tragedy. The man who sat on kitchen floors and laughed. The man who explained what lived inside a chord. The man who called from Belgium and said, "I love you," when the distance made it easier. The man who was, underneath everything else, a father and a son, and a human being navigating the same impossible territory that all human beings navigate, with the additional burden of doing it while the world watched. The world finally listened, not to Bubby's version of events. Bubby was too private a person to impose his version on anyone, but to the music that had been waiting, patiently and permanently, for each successive generation to discover it and find in it whatever they needed to find. The music that had been made by a man who had grown up in a house where love arrived with conditions, who had learned from his mother that voice was a gift, and from his father that gifts could also be weapons, who had spent his entire life trying to say something true and had largely succeeded, who had left behind a son who had been in the house on April 1st, 1984, and had heard the shot and had spent 40 years figuring out how to keep going. Bubby Gaye kept going because the music kept going. Because every time he heard his father's voice, in a grocery store, in a film, in the headphones of a stranger on a subway who did not know that the man standing beside them had heard Marvin Gaye's last morning, he was reminded that the things that matter do not end when the people who made them end. They go on. They find new ears. They do the work that they were always meant to do. Marvin Gaye's son watched his father die, and then he spent 40 years making sure his father's music lived. The world finally listened. It has never stopped. If this story moved you, if you felt something hearing about a son who carried a loss the world could not fully imagine and used it to protect something the world could not afford to lose, subscribe and hit that like button. Share this video with someone who is carrying something heavy and needs to be reminded that what we protect matters as much as what we create. Leave a comment telling us, what does Marvin Gaye's music mean to you? Ring that notification bell so you never miss another story about the legends who changed music forever. We will see you in the next one.